This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Typhoon Bebinca claims 2 lives in China's Jiangsu province. As the cleanup begins, another looming threat. Tropical storm Pulasan is set to approach later this week. In the South China Sea, the U.S. backs the Philippines' right to operate in the disputed waters as Manila sends a replacement vessel to Sabina Shoal. Japan and the U.S. said to be nearing a deal to further tighten tech exports to China, making it harder for Asia's largest economy to access chip-making tools. And the world's biggest appliance maker, MidAutumn, popping in its Hong Kong debut, fueling hopes for more blockbuster IPOs. Ahead on East Asia tonight, the MidAutumn Festival in Hong Kong is about more than just mooncakes and lanterns. Find out how young people are keeping the century-old fire dragon dance alive. And a surge in domestic travel in China ahead of festivities, many using a 3-day break to visit friends and relatives or even go on a holiday. And we'll also show you how it is possible to vacation on just $15 a day. Typhoon Bebinca has left 2 people dead in China's Jiangsu province. Reports say a high-voltage power line fell and electrocuted the residents in the town of Zhoushi, some 80 kilometers from Shanghai. One elderly man was also reported to be injured by a falling tree on Shanghai's Chongming Island. Bebinca, which has been downgraded into a tropical storm, swept over the region yesterday, bringing torrential rains and strong winds. It's the most powerful storm to hit the city of 25 million people in more than 7 decades. Hundreds of thousands were displaced from their homes, just as the nation marked Mid-Autumn Festival, a 3-day public holiday. The typhoon flooded roads, knocked out power to some homes, and even damaged some buildings. Weather officials warn that parts of Anhui, Henan, Hebei, Shandong, and Jiangsu provinces could see heavy downpours into tomorrow. And we are not done with typhoon season. Another large tropical storm, Pulasan, is expected to approach later in the week after making its way near southwestern Japan. Right, for more now, let's speak with CNA's Tan Yuguan once again in Shanghai. Yuguan, first up, help us assess what's the situation on the ground and how exactly are residents coping?
Well, actually, life has returned to normal pretty quickly here in Shanghai. I think you can see behind me, traffic has returned to the streets. The people have returned to the streets. It is the 3rd and the last day of the 3-day Mid-Autumn Festival and holidays, and therefore shoppers were out in force as if making up for lost time. You did report yesterday there were some 400,000 people who were evacuated from their homes ahead of yesterday's Typhoon Bebinca. Well, we got to see this evacuation in the context of a city of 25 million people. And these evacuees have also returned home since yesterday afternoon, except for a few which had special circumstances. As for the rest of the city, well, it might be a public holiday. The cleaners were clearly not on holiday because the streets are pretty much cleaned up. There were pretty much no debris on the streets when I went out today. Kelly?
Oh, good to know you, Guan. Also, I remembered yesterday, you showed us debris falling right in the middle of a shopping street in Shanghai. What has happened there? Has that also been cleared up?
Yes, Oteli, I think let's call up yesterday's clip in case some of our viewers did not catch what happened at Huaihai Middle Road, which is one of the busiest shopping streets in Shanghai, barely a couple of kilometers from where I'm standing right now. Now, let's see what a difference a day makes. If I can trouble studio to call up a clip that I filmed today at the very same spot. Now, Huaihai Road is a busy shopping street, as I mentioned earlier, and given today is a public holiday, it was just as busy. There were no signs of debris on the streets or on the road. However, I did spot some broken windows above the Nike shop where the debris fell. But other than that, it was pretty much back to normal. And pardon the pun, you could say that millions of people in Shanghai has pretty much went ahead with whatever they had in mind and just did it.
Yeah, Yugon, yeah, the cleanup was done very quickly overnight. But what about those disturbing images of panels falling off tall apartment buildings? What are people saying about that?
Well, many netizens were, of course, rather disturbed. Some said that it really shows you the shoddy nature of some of the projects here, and this is nature testing those shoddy projects. And others pointed out, the buildings in Shanghai are pretty old, and given that they have not been tested by typhoon of any sort. We did ask for some expert opinion from someone at an architectural firm, and he told us that these panels are actually insulation panels. They are pretty light. They're not that lethal. They're actually made of polystyrene material. They are kind of plastic foam. And the ability to withstand wind load because of that is also pretty weak because they are pretty much glued together. And after a long period of expansion and contraction, part of that glue will actually fall off. And he also thinks that the shedding of this material will happen there'll be more instances of this to come because he said, because China started using these sort of insulation materials about 20 to 30 years ago. And at that point in time, there wasn't that much expertise with regards to this particular material. And so therefore, he thinks that some of them might not have been installed properly. And as time goes by, water could seep in and wash away the glue, and therefore resulting in these panels falling off. As you know, the last time Shanghai was hit directly by a typhoon of Bebinca's strength was in 1949, and that's when Typhoon Gloria hit Shanghai directly. And therefore, many of these buildings, while they are not very new, they were not tested by typhoon as they were yesterday by Bebinca. Oteli?
Right, and I believe those panels and buildings will be tested again when the approaching storm comes around next week. But hopefully not. But thank you so very much, CNA's Tan Yu-Guan, speaking to us from Shanghai. Now, in other news, Washington says that it will continue to support the Philippines in its freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. It says it's Manila's right to decide how it intends to operate Philippine vessels in the region. Well, the comments come just days after the Philippines pulled out a ship stationed at the disputed Sabina Shoal following a months-long standoff with China.
The Philippines has endured repeated attempts by the PRC to interfere with their freedom of navigation on the high seas near Sabina Shoal over the past several months. There's no legal basis for the PRC's maritime claims in the South China Sea, and the dangerous ways in which it attempts to enforce those claims put Filipino lives and livelihood at risk.
BRP Teresa Macbanua was deployed to Sabina Shoal in April to monitor what Manila suspects to be possible reclamation activities by China. The Philippines says the withdrawal of its vessel is not a defeat, citing humanitarian reasons for the pullout, and has also vowed to continue its presence in the contested waters, promising an immediate replacement. Beijing, which refers to Sabina Shoal as Xianbin Reef, views Manila's actions as an incursion on China's sovereignty. The Chinese Coast Guard saying it will continue to carry out what it calls law enforcement activities to safeguard its maritime interests. Now, my colleague Angela Lim spoke to Colin Koh, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Defence and Strategic Studies, and they discussed the implications of the latest developments on the long-running dispute.
The asymmetry between the Philippines and China when it comes to its maritime forces is a structural long-term issue. It is not foreseeable that the Philippines will be able to build Coast Guard vessels to the same quantity as what the China would be fielding out in the South China Sea. And moreover, since you mentioned about the Philippine maritime security, we need to be reminded that the Philippines is a pretty considerable archipelago of its own, and there are other security issues throughout its archipelagic waters that require attention. So unless the Philippines is able to devote all resources to Palawan, which faces the South China Sea, and to devote more resources to the area, then it will be a long-term challenge for the Philippines to sustain or even maintain its presence in what they call the West Philippine Sea.
Now let's talk a bit about the next steps that we might foresee from China. Is the withdrawal of the ship likely to encourage or deter further actions from the Chinese side?
I don't think so. so far, whatever we have seen that has panned out over the past almost 1 year, ever since the last major incident happened, it is clear that whatever the Philippines is doing right now, alongside with its friendly partners, as well as its US ally, hasn't been able to dissuade China to roll back on its activity. So far, what we see here is the support that was given to Manila by the US and its allies and other friendly partners might be able to deter China from undertaking more drastic actions. However, if we look back at some months ago during the June 17 clash at the other feature called Second Thomas Shore, the risk of these sort of standoffs and incidents escalating into something that is bigger and more serious, even if it is not premeditated, cannot be discounted.
I want to pick up on that possible escalation there. So what does the US mean when it says that it will continue to support the Philippines in the freedom of navigation in South China Sea? Could we see the risk of direct conflict between the US and China as things escalate in the region?
I don't think the United States State Department has characterized the problem correctly. Instead of saying that it supports the Philippine freedom of navigation, which usually pertains to what we usually call the rights and freedom of other users in one's exclusive economic zone, I will believe that the State Department ought to use the term in support of the Philippine sovereign rights, and that term itself is enshrined within the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. But put that terminology aside, I think the US has not been very upfront when it comes to what sort of direct actions or direct measures that it will take in support of the Philippines. So far, we have seen only public statements to that account. And of course, on top of that, joint exercises and the routine US military presence in the area. But certainly there is now talk in Manila and elsewhere that maybe the US needs to do something more robustly in order to support the Philippines when it comes to asserting its rights over those features.
Now, Colin, before we go, what is China's endgame in the South China Sea? To what extent is it willing to lay claim to what it defines as its own territory?
Yeah. Firstly, I don't think China is prepared or is interested in sparking an all-out conflict in the South China Sea, given, first of all, its domestic problems right now, and of course, given that it has a much bigger fish to fry, and by that I mean Taiwan. And so therefore, a conflict in the South China Sea might not be its interest in the long term. So the end game for China, which some experts may call the boiling frog strategy, is essentially to wait out, to gradually try to erode Manila's persistence and its endurance in the South China Sea to the point that at some point of time, Manila will be able to concede some of its rights in favor of China's interests. And of course, if you put a timeline to that, maybe what China might be looking for is at least up to the end of the Marcos Jr. administration in 2028. Given what China has right now, and if there are no other unforeseen circumstances, if China keeps up with what it's doing, then it might be able to sort of last out Manila in what some will call the long game in the South China Sea.
China, meantime, says that it has scrambled fighter jets to monitor a U.S. Navy reconnaissance aircraft along the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. 7th Fleet defended the move, saying it demonstrates Washington's commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Well, the Strait is a sensitive region situated between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan. Beijing views the island as its own and also claims jurisdiction over the body of water. The U.S. and Taiwan insist it is an international waterway. It's the second time in under a week that foreign militaries have transited the area. Beijing on Saturday condemned the transit of 2 German Navy ships consisting of a frigate and a supply vessel. It said the move raised security risks in the area. The U.S. has approved a possible arms sale package of spare parts to Taiwan, valued at about $228 million. Well, the State Department says the equipment will be transferred from the government stock and that Taiwan's military will have no issue integrating them into its armed forces. Well, the island's defense ministry has expressed its gratitude, saying that the parts will help Taiwan maintain the combat readiness and safety of its air force. Despite a lack of formal ties, Washington is Taiwan's most important backer and arms supplier. China, which views the self-ruled island as its own, has ramped up military and political pressure over the past 5 years to assert its claims over Taiwan. Taipei strongly rejects China's claims. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Japan tries to soothe the investor concerns after it classified 7&i Holdings as a firm that's core to its national security. And Hong Kong is set to unveil its maiden policy statement on the use of artificial intelligence in finance as it tries to revive its status as a key hub. Hello again. Good to have you on East Asia Tonight this Tuesday. Standing by, as usual, is Roland Lim with the very latest in business news. And Roland, it looks like U.S. and Japan, they're very close to a deal on in terms of how they can further limit China's access to all these advanced chip-making technology. Where are we on that?
Yes, you heard right. Intense discussions between the two close allies that may be concluding. And that's despite Tokyo's fears over Beijing's threat to retaliate against Japanese companies. The Financial Times reports the White House wants to unveil new export controls before November's presidential election. Now, the measures would include a provision forcing non-US companies to get licenses to sell products to China that would help its tech sector. The report says the Biden administration officials have held intense talks with their counterparts in both Japan and the Netherlands for months to establish complementary export control regimes. It also says Japan is concerned China would block exports of critical minerals, particularly gallium and graphite, if Tokyo adopts the export controls being pushed by the US. The US export curbs are designed to close loopholes in existing rules and add restrictions that reflect Huawei's and other Chinese groups' fast progress in chip production over the past 2 years. Now, Washington wants to make it harder for China to obtain critical chip-making tools. The latest restrictions would have the biggest impact on ASML in the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron in Japan. Japan's finance minister says that the new classification of 7&i as core to the country's national security will not hinder potential buyouts. Now, his comments are seen as an attempt at easing investor concerns. Experts say any sign of protectionism may blunt enthusiasm for Japanese stocks, as well as mergers and acquisitions. Now, concerns arose after 7-Eleven's parent became one of 88 companies added to the Japanese government's list of firms regarded as crucial to national security. Now, once a firm is identified as core, foreign entities seeking to buy a stake in it must first file for a national security review with the government. Analysts saw the new classification of 7&i as an attempt to better defend itself from a potential takeover by Canada's Alimentation Couche-Tard, which had offered $38.5 billion for the company. Now, 7&i earlier this month rejected the deal, citing concerns over the price. The potential buyout is being closely watched due to the implications it has for the retail industry in Japan and for further clues on the path Japan's government will take. Meantime, Indonesia aims to more than double the number of workers it sends to Japan. Southeast Asia's biggest economy will send some 250,000 workers over the next 5 years from 100,000. Indonesia's manpower minister said that that's partly in response to Japan's expanded specified skilled workers visa program. Indonesia is the biggest source of such workers to Japan, accounting for 15,000 last year. They work in fields spanning nursing care, construction, and machine operation. In March, Japan raised the upper limit of this program to 820,000 for 5 years. Now, that's from 345,000 previously. Indonesia suggests Japan consider recognizing qualifications achieved at local universities and nursing schools as well. A stellar debut for China's largest home appliance maker, Midea, in their maiden trade in Hong Kong. The stock jumping nearly 16% from its issue price at one point. It's since pared back those gains, closing out about 8% higher, $59.10 Hong Kong apiece. The offering was priced at $54.80 Hong Kong apiece, and that was at the top end of its marketed price range. The $4 billion listing is the city's biggest in more than 3 years since short video app Kuaishou's debut back in 2021. The successful debut could bolster investor confidence in Hong Kong's IPO market, which has been struggling in recent years amid China's economic and regulatory struggles. But some industry watchers say the blockbuster listing is not enough to signal a broader revival in public offerings. The MyIdeas listing has pushed Hong Kong's IPO proceeds to $6.5 billion this year, more than the total volume in all of 2023. But it's still below bumper levels seen in previous years. Now, earlier we asked Nomura's Gareth Nicholson where he thinks Hong Kong's IPO market is headed following MyIdeas blockbuster listing.
I think it's important, that we're starting to see a shift in IPOs, an increase. It has come off a pretty poor base. The first half of 2024, the Hong Kong IPO market was roughly down 20% compared to average. Seeing big listings like this is constructive. It'd be very interesting to see how the market does take this. As we know, any good trade, any good investment from an investor needs a combination of three things: fundamentals, valuation, and technicals. Now, whilst valuation for Hong Kong and China markets are relatively compelling versus many other markets globally, which have done well over the last few years, the technicals and the fundamentals have been struggling. The technicals will increase if this IPO does well, and if we see a continued increase in IPOs in the second half of 2024, which will be great for the broader market. The fundamentals we're still struggling with. We're seeing retail sales and a number of other economic data points in China being pulled back. So from a medium-term view, the economic picture still needs more support, and we look for that from the government, ideally to help prop this up. So there is going to be this weighing out of these three factors to see if this IPO is not successful in its own, but also it brings back forth more IPOs and more support for the Hong Kong-China market.
Hong Kong is planning to unveil its maiden policy statement on the use of artificial intelligence in finance later this year. The move could accelerate the use of AI in areas spanning trading, investment banking, and cryptocurrencies, as the city grapples with an ongoing US-China technology conflict. Hong Kong's Financial Services and Treasury Bureau is considering a framework of guidelines covering the ethical use of AI and general principles for applying the technology in the finance industry. Though the document is still in its early days, the move broadly signals Hong Kong's support for AI. The document will not be immediately enforceable, though. Hong Kong is seeking to rebuild its status as a financial center, but foreign investors remain wary about Beijing's growing control. Against this backdrop, local regulators are grappling with confusion over the use of AI in Hong Kong. Now, many consumers and corporations are still not able to access services such as OpenAI's ChatGPT and Google's Gemini. Let's take a look at some stock market action. Japan's Nikkei 225 ending 1% lower, weighed down by worries of a stronger yen. The investors are bracing for a supersized interest rate cut from the US Fed this week, which would weaken the greenback. Technology giants were the biggest drags on the Nikkei, and broader losses in export-dependent companies as well. Different story in Hong Kong, which pegs its currency to the dollar. Lower interest rates stateside will lead the city's central bank to cut borrowing costs as well. And that's spurring hopes that the Hong Kong property sector will get a lift. The Hang Seng Property Index jumping more than 2% today, while the broader market rose nearly 1.4%. Meantime, markets in the mainland, Taiwan, South Korea closed for a public holiday. And that is the latest in business, Oteli.
Thanks very much for that, Roland. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, TikTok and its content creators in the US make their case against an impending nationwide ban. Updating today's top stories, Typhoon Bebinca claims 2 lives in China's Jiangsu province. As the cleanup begins, another looming threat. Tropical storm Pulasan set to approach later this week. The US backs the Philippines' right to operate in the disputed South China Sea as Manila sends a replacement vessel to Savina Shoal. And shares of the world's biggest appliance maker, MidAutumn, soar in its Hong Kong debut, fueling hopes for more blockbuster IPOs. And before we get to other East Asian stories, we turn to Myanmar, where the death toll from flooding has doubled from the weekend, climbing to 226. The country is reeling from Typhoon Yagi, which swept across parts of Southeast Asia more than a week ago. The storm wreaked havoc in the region, killing more than 500 people in total. Well, hundreds of thousands of people across Myanmar are displaced. The United Nations warns that more than 630,000 people could be in need of aid. Downed communication lines, blocked roads, and damaged bridges have hampered relief efforts. Shortages in basic necessities, such as food and water, have prompted the military to issue a rare appeal for foreign aid, despite the government previously blocking international humanitarian assistance. India has responded by sending dry rations, clothing, and medicine. But officials say more resources are urgently needed. Forecasters say central Myanmar, including the capital Naypyidaw, remains the worst hit. More than 60,000 homes have been inundated by the floods, alongside scores of rice paddies and other crops. Even before the latest floods, people in Myanmar were already grappling with the effects of 3 years of war between the military government and ethnic armed groups, with millions forced from their homes by the conflict. Well, CNA spoke to Nadia Khoury, head of delegation in Myanmar from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and she told us how the conflict in Myanmar could impact ongoing humanitarian efforts.
So what we've seen in the past week is that an extremely heavy amount of rainfall has come in a short time, flooding houses, flooding agricultural crops, destroying infrastructure. And it has affected what we estimate to be about 20% of the townships in the whole country. So it's absolutely huge. An estimated 630,000 people have been affected. And as the communications are increasingly difficult, as you imagine, a lot of the communications infrastructure has been destroyed. We are getting, as the days pass, a clearer picture of the vast amount of damages. We know that some close to 200 or 300,000 people have already been evacuated from their homes. And we know that there's a huge amount of needs now for these populations. The first immediate need is water, food, shelter, and safety. But many of them have lost their homes. Many of them had to be rescued from rooftops, and there will be a long journey for those populations to recover.
And of course, all of this is complicated, of course, by the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. How has it exacerbated the situation caused by the floods?
That's right. We have an already very vulnerable population. Over 3 million people are estimated to have been displaced in Myanmar since the start of the year. And we now see that this is a compounded effect for these populations who are already extremely needy. It's very challenging for those populations at the moment, and they have needs in terms of access to health, which was already restricted, access to clean water, access to a shelter, and access to recovery for their livelihoods. Many of them have lost their cattle, many of them have lost their agricultural lands, many have lost sources of tourism, and we've seen areas also in the capital city affected. So it's compounding the impact for this population, which has already been suffering through multiple shocks over the past few years.
And we know also that a third of the population is now in need of aid. But how has the Myanmar government responded to the floods? What role are they playing in relief efforts here?
The State Administration Council, according to reports by the state media, has been carrying out evacuations of people who have been stranded. They have opened temporary relief centres, and they have been engaged in the immediate assistance to populations that they're able to reach. There are so many needs that there is also a lot of efforts from local actors, such as the Myanmar Red Cross, with whom we work very closely. Other national societies are also supporting, and other organizations. There's quite a lot of amount of local support from local communities. The amount of generosity is very impressive in terms of what communities are willing to contribute to their neighbors, and more will be needed. So we are hoping to launch an emergency appeal for additional assistance to be carried out through the Myanmar Red Cross, our main partner in country, for those early response needs that I've already mentioned, as well as assistance over the next 3 to 6 months and even up to the next year.
It's the eve of historic polls in Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir, a region claimed by both India and Pakistan and long marked by violence and unrest. Well, nearly 9 million people are registered to vote in its first local election in a decade. Up until 2019, Jammu and Kashmir had a special semi-autonomous status under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. But the Modi government stripped the region of its semi-autonomy and statehood, effectively bringing it under New Delhi's direct control. Jammu and Kashmir were also downgraded to a union territory. In the 90-seat assembly, Kashmir has 47 seats and Jammu has 43. The next two phases will be held in the next 2 weeks, with counting scheduled for 8th of October. Ishan Garg has more on how the region has evolved and the significance of this election.
This election is particularly significant because for the past 5 years, the people here have lived without a local representative, which has meant that in their minds, they believe as though any of the issues that they wanted to complain about, they didn't really have a representative, because for the past 5 years, vast territories of Jammu and Kashmir region have been under the federal control by the Delhi government. So this time around, when people are going to go to the polling booths, their main ask is that the status of statehood for the region of Jammu and Kashmir should be restored. This status was stripped off in 2019 when autonomy was also taken away from this state after this particular article called Article 370, which gave Kashmir special powers, was revoked. So when people go to the polls, they are saying that they're going to be voting on one hand to tell the federal government in Delhi that they want to elect local representatives that talk about what Kashmiri people want. And on another hand, they're also going to go to the polls to talk about their very personal issues, the issues of rising unemployment in the Kashmir Valley, the issue of rising inflation in the Kashmir Valley. So it's got two facets to it. A, of course, local issues are going to be important, but there's another side which Kashmiri people say they want their voices to be heard through their own local representatives. Well, numerous things have changed and some things haven't. For example, security obviously has been a big concern in Kashmir for past several decades. This is one of the most highly militarized regions in the world. You will see army presence every few meters across the region of Kashmir. And one of the things that the government says has happened in the past 5 years is that militancy has been brought under control. The heavy security deployment here has meant, according to the government, that the forces of secession, the forces that wanted Kashmir to become a part outside of India, that wanted Kashmir to separate from India, those forces have been subdued by a very large margin. That's what the government's perspective is. From the people's perspective, they say that a lot has changed since Article 370, but not in a good way, because they say that a lot of the funding that would have come in the past has now sort of dried up. They want their funding to come from the state's resources, such as electricity production and also the businesses. And they say those things have suffered since in the past 5 years. So that's also once again going to be a huge issue in this election. But widely what the political parties here are claiming, and also the voters here are saying, is that what they want is Kashmir to become a full state once again, so that it can have more autonomy over its policies and also better access to funding.
Well, Hong Kong's chief executive John Lee warns that American businesses will suffer if Washington passes a bill to close Hong Kong's trade offices in the region.
These are political tactics to suppress the development of China and also Hong Kong. These are shameless and ugly political tactics.
Last Tuesday, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act, questioning whether the territory remained sufficiently autonomous to justify having separate representation from Beijing. If the bill is enacted, the U.S. Secretary of State would have to annually review the immunities given to 3 Hong Kong trade offices based in the U.S. The bill still needs to be cleared by the Senate and ultimately President Joe Biden. Well, China immediately slammed the act's passing, accusing Washington of politicizing normal economic cooperation and warning that they too will take strong countermeasures. Video sharing giant TikTok has squared off against the U.S. Justice Department at a federal court hearing. At stake, a nationwide ban on the app should it refuse to divest from its Chinese parent company, ByteDance. Well, lawyers from both sides appeared before a 3-judge panel as the company sought an injunction against the ban. TikTok content creators, including activists and business owners, were also roped in as plaintiffs.
There's thousands and thousands of us, and this ban would essentially destroy our business. We do about 90% of our business on TikTok, and hopefully, with this court hearing, we'll win and it'll save our business, essentially.
President Joe Biden signed the potential ban into law in April after Congress deemed the Chinese-owned platform a national security threat, given its extensive access to user data. Well, TikTok filed a lawsuit in May, claiming that the ban violated the free speech rights of both the platform and its users.
For the first time in history, Congress has expressly targeted a specific U.S. speaker, banning its speech and the speech of 170 million Americans.
Congress has given the app used by over half the U.S. population until January to split from ByteDance. The company has so far refused to comply. TikTok and the Justice Department have asked for a ruling by December to allow the Supreme Court to consider any appeal before a ban takes effect. Coming up on East Asia tonight, the 145-year-old fire dragon kept alive and breathing in Hong Kong as celebrations get underway for the Mid-Autumn Festival. Japan has been taking measures to counter the effects of over-tourism. You may recall that officials imposed entry restrictions on Mount Fuji earlier this year to limit the daily number of climbers. Well, that move, while successful in reducing the numbers, is apparently also working very well against another problem, the so-called bullet climbing, or attempts to summit Mount Fuji without sufficient rest, or taking time to acclimatize. Now, such moves have been cut by an estimated 90% after the Yamanashi Gate was closed between 4 p.m. and 3 a.m. the following day. The prefecture now wants to put up a permanent gate ahead of the next climbing season. Neighboring Shizuoka Prefecture, meantime, is considering whether to charge entry fees along with implementing restrictions from next year. It is the Mid-Autumn Festival, and young people in Hong Kong are celebrating a yearly tradition that's 145 years old, the Fire Dragon Dance, and it's part of festivities in Hong Kong's historic Tai Hang district. As you can see, big crowds turned up to watch the Fire Dragon Parade. 100 children and young people also joined in with a 20-meter little fire dragon alongside the main attraction that's 67 meters long. Women were traditionally not allowed to touch the great dragon during the dance, but the Youth League is now offering women a chance to take part.
咁當初我身為小朋友，仲要係女仔咧，就係可以玩沙燈啊，或者由小朋友開始玩蓮花燈。其實個感覺係有少少失落嘅，因為我哋甚至連掂一掂條龍，其實女仔都唔可以。咁所以而家開始有得我哋可以接觸啦，學到呢門藝術，就算我哋唔可以，都係唔可以掂大龍都好，但係有得玩呢樣嘢，知道係咩嘅一回事，其實已經好開心，好慶幸可以 join 到呢件事咁樣咯。
In Beijing, the city held its largest ever lantern fair. Some 100,000 lanterns were on display. Organizers say their designs are inspired by traditional Chinese painting, poetry, and legends. The festival happens on the 15th day of the 8th month in the lunar calendar, and people usually celebrate by eating mooncakes. Zoo animals in southwest China were no exception. In Chongqing, giant pandas had special mooncakes made of fruit and vegetables. A gorilla called Yuhui enjoyed one that is made of nuts. And in Yunnan, lemurs and raccoons had a feast of tomatoes, peanuts, and steamed cornbread, all good things for their diet. China is seeing a travel surge over the 3-day Mid-Autumn Festival holiday. The Transport Ministry recorded more than 200 million passenger trips on Sunday. That's a 38% increase from last year. The vast majority of travelers took to the road, making up 90% of those 200 million trips. Rail is a distant second, making up just under 8%. The rail network said that most travelers took short-distance trips to visit family and friends. Information from travel agencies and online platforms also show an uptick in overseas travel. The People's Daily says short-haul destinations like Hong Kong, Macau, Thailand and Japan are top choices. Further afield, New Zealand and the US also in demand. Well, as the Chinese economy enters a new normal of tighter incomes and lower consumption, the trend of qiong, or traveling poor, is picking up. CNA's Money Mind followed a young couple traveling the country and spending as little as possible.
Mu Ziyi is on holiday again. She's made over 30 trips over the past 3 years. And she's done it all on a budget of 100 renminbi or under $14 a day. Here's how she does it. For this trip, the 24-year-old and her boyfriend start with a 7-hour rail journey. Ziyi got her ticket for about a third of the price by picking a longer journey on this old-fashioned green train instead of a 3-hour, more expensive ride on an express train.
相对于其他的交通工具来说，我觉得绿皮火车是最省钱的。可能我坐高铁的话，从我的出发地到保定的话，可能要花200块钱。但是坐绿皮火车的话，可能就可能花60多块钱，能省大概1/3的价钱。
They're traveling 300 kilometers from their university town to Baoting in North China's Hebei province. These young travelers are happy to sacrifice time and comfort for affordability. This type of travel is also known as qiong in China. It literally means tourism for the poor, traveling on a shoestring, usually independently.
Given that unemployment rate in China among the younger generation is still very high, roughly at 15% earlier this year, and also that disposable income has become much more constrained. And therefore, I think from an economic reality standpoint, they also have much lower budget to spend on traveling among all the other activities and expenses they have. And therefore, they adopted this kind of travel to both achieve what they want to do from a travel demand standpoint, but also to achieve it within a reasonable budget that they can afford.
Fresh out of university, Ziyi manages on an allowance from her parents of about 1,500 renminbi or $200. She spends almost half of this sum on traveling. And she makes sure the money goes further by making extensive use of online resources.
我会通过3个平台吧，比如说同城啊、携程、飞猪，我会去比对我认为性价比比较高的一些酒店的一些价格。比如说，你看这个酒店的话，在飞猪上面它就是95块钱，但是在同城上面它又更便宜一点，就是73块钱。
For this trip, she's found a basic hotel room, but includes the luxury of a private bathroom. And since she usually travels with her boyfriend, her share of the cost of the room is halved.
这房间的话，我是不到100块钱，97块钱订的保定火车站市中心一点的吧，去哪玩都比较方便。然后进门之后，这边的话，卫生间还是一个独卫，虽然小的话，但是它还是都够用的，包括我们这房间都有空调，比单独去住啊、青旅啊。
When it's time to explore the city, they hop on an electric bike. At 20 renminbi a day, it's a fairly cheap and convenient way to get around. When it's time for dinner, they stop at an eatery that offers value meals and budget-friendly options. They get a serving of 牛肉炒饼 or flatbread and beef soup. A set for 2 costs around 40 renminbi. That's under $3 per person. The night market offers a tempting range of food and merchandise, but all Ziyi chooses is a cup of jasmine tea.
天津银行收款3元。
Her tally for the day, with hotel and train travel, is a little over her budget, but she'll make up for it on day 2, as she won't have to pay for hotels or train travel. The second day is spent taking in more cultural sites. With their student ID still valid, they pay an entrance fee of 15 renminbi or $2. That's half the normal price. A quick stop for a lunch of luruo huo shao or donkey burger sets her back just 3 renminbi. It's a local specialty that's popular in Hebei province. The Baoding Natural History Museum, like most museums in China, offers free entry for locals. But Ziyi is organized enough to plan ahead.
好漂亮！这个票特别难约，我们提前7天才约得上的。今天我们花费是2张票价0元。
Before calling it a day, they enjoy a local cultural show that's also free. Taking stock of her expenses, Ziyi has spent a total of 179 renminbi or $25 for this 2-day trip, well within her budget. And this is basically how she went about it.
我觉得是值得的。为什么？因为虽然说，我觉得穷游吧，特种兵旅行很考验一种身体素质。虽然说你在路途上面是很累的，可能说，我们出去玩的话，可能遇不到志同道合的人，对吧？可能会遇到一些令自己不太开心的人或事儿。但是说，当你到达那个城市，当你到达你想去的城市之后，你看到那样的景色，你就会觉得哇，一切都值得了那种感觉。
There's still a very strong desire to travel, even though economic situation might not allow them to travel very luxuriously. But it also shows that the Chinese travelers, especially a younger generation, are more focused on the experience itself than just spending on luxurious goods. So what we have seen in the past is that a lot of people have picked locations with cultural destinations, exploring more of the city. So they join a lot of city walk, which are of very low cost or even for free. They explore new destinations and new locations, trying to find basically new gems in the city that they can post on social media. And I think this showcased that this is more about experience itself rather than just about spending money.
我觉得穷游的话，对我来说不仅仅是为了省钱，包括说我从一开始，从我去谋划这个攻略，这座城市的每个景点的规划，对我来说，可能对我以后做的每一件事情来说，我都会有一个深思熟虑的过程。包括说未来的话，不管是遇到什么事情，我都希望我自己都可以有一个很强大的内心。
Pretty impressive cost-saving methods there. On that note, it's time for us to wrap up East Asia Tonight. Your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Look us up, Facebook, YouTube, and on X. We're everywhere. Thanks for watching.